Hey everybody, welcome to Center Stage. I'm Rajiv, and today I have Sunder Sarangan, CMO at Persistent Systems.
Hey, thanks for
joining me today.
Sure, welcome.
So tell us a little bit about Persistence and your journey, how you got here as CMO.
Sure. So Persistent Systems, we're a company that we build software. For about 25 years, we've been building software for companies in the business of software. Over the last 5 years, it's kind of a blurring world in terms of who is a software company, who's not a software company. We work today with companies in healthcare, in banking and finance, in industrial sectors, all of whom are acting and behaving like a software company. And so what we've done in the first 25 years of the company, we've now taken it to a wider market, another broader set of industries. That's what we do for their business. And as more and more of their business starts running on software, we become more and more core to the business that they operate, to their clients, to their stakeholders in healthcare, to their patients. And
Got it.
so that's kind of what Persistent does.
And you've been at Persistent for 5 years. Prior to that, you were at Infosys for 14 years. Tell us about your journey.
So, prior to Infosys, I was a programmer, which in the mid-90s, I wanted to be out of the world of technology. So got my MBA, went back, and the most popular thing to do was doing ERP implementations then, and that to me felt like more technology. So I joined Infosys in what was then a much smaller company with $60 million, hard to believe it today. And it was a great journey there where when I left them, they were just shy of $8 billion or something like that.
That's incredible growth.
And started doing some strategy, marketing, business development. There was a group of 5 people who didn't sell or deliver projects. So that was a kind of very small company then. And over time, when I left them, I was running all of the business end of the marketing function, which was industries, service lines, all operations in the global markets. The way I used to joke about it, anything except the color of the logo and the corporate stuff that needed to be done in India around investors and things like that. And then the opportunity at Persistent was that it was really a greenfield opportunity to go into a company just under $300 million of revenue, established 25-year-old company, but
now close to $600 million.
Now close to $500 million. Build a marketing organization from scratch and help tell a story that I felt had not been told in the market. And that was the opportunity I jumped onto. And it's been a great journey so far. And as I think of it 5 years down, I feel it's time to fire myself and rehire myself to take that story to the next level.
Love it. Fantastic. We were talking prior to this about sort of applying the agile philosophy when it comes to software development to business solutions and business software. And you guys have coined this software 4.0, and you're talking about sort of continuous transformation by design.
Right.
So talk a little bit about that.
So for anyone who's been in software, the way I would think is software has always been built in an iterative and an incremental fashion. There have been minor upgrades, major upgrades, versions 1.x, 1.0x.
Sure. Lots of iterations. At some point, everyone can relate to that.
And at some point, it jumps from 1 to 2.
Sure.
And there's a whole visioning for what that next release should be, what that next big version should be, and launch should be. In some ways, what Software 4.0, the idea was to bring that mindset of building software and that mindset of building software, designing software, or what I would call software design and build, into how you build and operate businesses. So when we call it Software 4.0, we were playing on the whole Industry 4.0 terminology, is that you're looking at a whole new way of designing and building and operating a business on the principles of this iterative, incremental, software-driven way, because more and more of every business today runs on software. And that was really the concept, idea around Software 4.0, which we've been talking about for about 2-3 years now. And it's not the first thing that jumps at you, but I think the thought behind us definitely resonates with people that we talk to.
And is the iterative process similar to sort of the software dev cycle? I mean, do you have 2-week sprints when it comes to business software solutions? How do you frame that in terms of applying this solution for businesses?
I think in an abstract way, it is quite similar. Whether that sprint is 2 weeks or a month or a quarter will vary from business to business, from process to process. But the whole idea is that you don't do a one-time point A to point B transformation, but you kind of have a roadmap and then you make progress towards the roadmap. And at every point, at every checkpoint, you figure out if the roadmap's still relevant and if you need to tweak the roadmap, but you continue to make that iterative incremental progress.
Got it. Let's talk about your role as Chief Marketing Officer. What does sort of your typical day or week look like at Persistent?
It kind of spans from figuring out the marketing roadmap to figuring out all the in-flight active work streams or what's in the current sprint, to occasionally dealing with a left field opportunity or crisis or situation and fitting that all into the day-to-day. So hard to give you a very easy answer to that kind of a question, but I would almost say what the typical day that most of us underestimate is the amount of time and energy that goes into block and tackle, and how that can often distract us from getting more strategic. And something that I personally challenge, I don't think I've conquered it or figured out a way to do it consistently, is to balance between that block and tackle and the strategy. But I think just knowing that that's a challenge makes you think about and kind of figuring out ways to do that.
Which is a great segue into, we talked again previously, why is long-term thinking important when it comes to marketing leadership?
So I'm not trying to pass judgment on other roles, but many roles are today, at least in public companies, driven by a quarter-to-quarter cycle. And especially as you start looking at sales, as you're looking at fulfillment, which is service delivery in our business, the short term always becomes more important than long term. And there needs to be an executive role that consciously puts long term over short term. Doesn't mean short term doesn't happen, and doesn't mean long term is a pure ivory tower strategy role. You still act on it in the short term, but taking a long term point of view into prioritization is very important. And I think marketing as a role, I believe, has to always focus on the long term and the long term relevance of any business to the markets that it works in.
Got it. You mentioned services, and again, we were talking about services prior to getting on camera, and we were talking about sort of this lack of innovation when it comes to services and sort of this apprehension of investing into services company. Talk about your point of view on services and what's happening in this industry.
So, if I look at every company from McKinsey to Accenture to an Infosys to a Persistent to about probably there's many staffing firms, they're all in that services fulfilling need of skilled talent to specific requirements. If I need creative, I would go to an agency. If I need some strategy help on the side of marketing, I would go to an agency or a crowdsourcing. But there is a situation today, as I see it, where the demand for talent across almost most areas of technology or technology and business far outstrips the supply of readily available talent. But the most significant innovations that are happening in terms of how that talent gets created, curated, and presented to the market and assembled as teams to get projects done, still happening largely among the largest firms, is happening, again, we do it in our own way, specifically in the product engineering space, where again, we are among the larger firms. But when here in the Valley, when I talk to the venture capital space, they all complain about how hiring is the biggest challenge for their portfolio companies. But none of them would want to invest in a services company because it's slow growth, it's linear, and it's probably just not cool.
Right.
And I think that's a self-fulfilling or a non-fulfilling cycle where the lack of investment in a breakthrough, disruptive way
Industry.
to do services is allowing the larger companies to move forward. They're not stagnant. The ones that are stagnant are falling back, but they're not stagnant. But there's no real disruptive threat or at a left field threat because this is not an industry that is facing the kind of disruptive change that many of the other industries are. And I almost feel that that creates a sense of stagnation.
Right.
Like if I think of it, I can't think of too many scalable business model changes that have happened to this industry since offshoring or global sourcing. That's 20 years ago when I started my career at Infosys. So to me, that at least that's my kind of frustration with the services world in terms of how or why it's not moving as fast as many of the client industries that it serves.
The larger companies are sort of dictating the pace of how it's changing.
They can afford to.
They can afford to. There's lack of investment, there's lack of really no investment.
There is lack of risk-taking investments to try something
different,
really different, innovative, that is disruptive, going to upset the large companies or upset them in a meaningful manner. There are small changes, and quite often most of the most interesting companies that surface up get gobbled up by one of the large companies sooner than later. But they're not impacting services as an industry at the core of what it does.
Makes sense. You also have a particular point of view when it comes to perspective and experience. We were talking about this, so how do you leverage perspective when it comes to experience? Don't just see the negative, but visualize the positive.
So again, I think you picked up on one of my tweets on this, and I think we need to put this in context. The tweet was about this image of how experience limits your worldview or prevents you from taking risk, and the more and more you draw boundaries and make your world smaller and smaller with experience, the less you tend to explore, and then over time, it showed an insect which kind of just goes around in a very small space because you're bordering off and preventing it from exploring and exploring new spaces outside. That was kind of the tweet. My response to that is it's easy to experience, it's easy to be negative about it. But it is also experience if that same insect was going to fall into a trap, if it was going to fall off the edge of a table, it is experience that teaches you how not to make mistakes.
Right.
And so what I always say is it's easy to be negative about everything. And we're all guilty of that. But it always helps to almost at every point of decision, maybe in your own mind, debate two extreme viewpoints. So you can try and argue it from two different sides, so you figure out where the middle ground is or what are the pros and cons. Maybe it's not about finding a middle ground, but knowing one extreme, aware of the risks of the extreme rather than kind of jumping into it. And it's less about positive and negative. It's almost about getting yourself to see two divergent viewpoints, both in the context of a specific situation. That was really what that comment was about.
Right, and you were referencing a movie called 12 Angry Men from the 60s. So for those of you who don't know it, we'll include it in our notes, which is a movie about sort of 12 people get selected for a jury and they don't want to do it, and you can,
So to me, that's a signature takeaway about the importance of debate and the importance of persistence. No pun to the company I work for, but it's one person who insists on the importance of process, debate, and getting true consensus on the jury, and bringing conflict and debate into a meeting room, which I feel in the last few years we've kind of been shy of or afraid of bringing on conflict and debate and having healthy conflict and debate in meetings and workplaces. And to me, that's where I'll kind of think back to 12 Angry Men, which is a movie from the 60s, so not too many people might know that. But to me, that's a great metaphor for why debate, conflict, as long as it's done in a healthy manner,
Sure.
is actually very important for us to eventually get to the right decision, which
Or a
is what
meaningful outcome.
or a meaningful outcome. Yeah.
Awesome. So you talked about firing and rehiring yourself. So, I mean, what excites you? What motivates you every day as Chief Marketing Officer?
I think the challenge for any role, whether I call it the CMO role or any role, is to be able to balance what the function and the role needs to do in the long term, have a very clear view on it, but then translate it into what needs to be done this week.
Sure.
And make sure that you're not caught up in too much of long-term thinking and that results in too little immediate action, or so caught up in the weeds of immediate action that you lose sight of the long-term thinking. And I think, to me, the biggest challenge, motivation, what I think about the most is, am I getting that balance right? Because doing the doing, I think I would like to believe I am, and most of us are pretty good at doing the doing. But getting the balance right is probably the most non-trivial part of what I do. But that's also what I constantly strive for. And in that, I feel that's something that's not just about the CMO role, but it's fundamental to any management position. That's the way I think of it.
So you're excited about sort of balancing and thinking about the long-term strategic with sort of the day-to-day, again, going back to block and tackle.
Right.
How often are you finding that balance?
I don't know. But
ongoing process.
But in doing that, I've built the utmost respect for the people who do the block and tackle, and having empathy for the activities that need to get done in terms of the block and tackle. Because otherwise I feel that it's very easy to get disconnected from the block and tackle and delegate and lose sight of what it really takes. The foundation of getting work done.
Sure. That's great. And speaking of balance, I mean, what do you think about living in the Valley and people are working so much, always grinding in terms of sort of this work and life balance? Do you think it's possible? Do you achieve that?
Again, it's one of those questions. It's possible. Have we achieved it? I don't think it's easy to say yes or no answer, but are we figuring it out on a day-to-day basis? I think it's not perfect, but it's not so bad that you need to drop it and run or move out or in any way. So, like, one of the things, talking of the Valley, for all my years living here, I've always had a commute of at least 35 to 40 miles.
40-minute commute, your phone is chiming. What do you do in that commute? What's your...
So, on the 40-minute commute, I figured out how to schedule it around conference calls with teams that are in a time zone.
Okay.
And I always make the commute about when I can be on a call without having to look at a screen.
Got it.
Or there's podcasts, which is a great way to know what's happening in the world of technology. So the reason I bring that up is you can look at the commute as a negative and a downer and say, I'm going to not take on a commute.
Sure,
or you can figure out how to make it most productive. And so that's the same thing about work-life balance. Like, another example that I would say is, when my kids were very young, I would do calls from 5 to 6, 5 to 6:30, but be available from 6:30 to 8 when you needed hands on deck to literally get the kids to their daycare or to school.
Yep.
And so it's just a question of how do you balance that out and plan ahead for it. And once you know what your roadmap is, doing the block and tackle on a day-to-day basis no different than what you do for work.
Time management skills. Speaking of podcasts, any podcast that excites you or that you've listened to recently that you want to recommend to our audience?
Well, I'm a fan of Freakonomics, Recode Decode by Kara Swisher.
Recode Decode by Kara Swisher, yep.
And then just one comes out of India. Pankaj Mishra has a podcast called Outliers, which is a little bit more centered around Indian tech entrepreneurship and Indian social and technology, where society and technology meets in India. But that's another one with some great perspectives.
Awesome. We'll keep those in the notes for this video. So, I mean, that's really all I have for you. Anything else you want to share with us?
Well, thanks for having me here. And it was a great pleasure to be here and have this conversation with you.
Thanks so much for your time. Thanks everyone for watching. Sunder, it's a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
CMO of Persistent Systems. I'm Rajiv with Center Stage. See you next time.